we're delighted to participate in this lecture, which is held under the auspices. It's held under the auspices of the Robert St. John Chair in Objective Middle East Reporting. Robert St. John is a veteran, or was a veteran, North American journalist. He has a long history in reporting, starting in Chicago in the years of the bosses and the mafias, and then moving from the printed press to the spoken press and NBC, covering the last years of World War II, and then later the establishment of Israel and all the wars of Israel. And at one point, about 20 years ago, he was named by the Israeli government as the veteran war reporter in Israel, since he had covered almost every one of the 6 or 7 wars that unfortunately this country has gone through. He and his family very generously donated a chair to this university, and once every few years we hold a lecture under its auspices. Our guest, the lecture is also being held in together with a conference that we held today on reporting or journalism and communications in the digital era. The conference was put together, and this lecture was put together with the cooperation of the Department of Communications, one of the smaller departments in our faculty, but anyone who looks at what they're doing will see they're certainly one of the most dynamic research and teaching departments. At the moment, they're just a graduate department, but they are very much on our strategic plans, and we're waiting for the Council of Higher Education to finally authorize their undergraduate degree, and we have plans to expand this very dynamic department. I would like to recognize here, I saw him walk in, Professor Dan Caspi. Dan, are you here? Oh, he's okay. Is he coming in right? Dan Caspi, one of the veteran founders of the department, retired a few years ago, and you'll just have to give it to him on your word that I said a good word about him. But he deserves it. He was one of the people who helped found and create the department before he retired. Our lecturer today is Ethan Bronner, Deputy National Editor of the New York Times, a graduate of the College of Letters at Wesleyan University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and he began his journalism career at Reuters in London in 1980. He is the author of Battle for Justice, which was named one of the best 25 books of 1989 by the New York Public Library, and has been awarded a Silver Gavel by the American Bar Association, and he's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former trustee of Wesleyan University. Ethan has been here in Israel, in Jerusalem, on a number of occasions as a correspondent, and most recently as the Times bureau chief from 2008 to 2012. He's also served as assistant editorial page editor of the Times, education editor and national education correspondent, so I don't think we could have a more qualified person to give us a lecture on the topic on In the Eye of the Storm, Reflections on Being Jerusalem Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Ethan, I have to tell you that last week I was at a conference to do with this university held in Jerusalem on the role of the Jewish community in the European integration process, and we had one session there on the role of the media. We had 2 journalists there, one Anshel Pfeffer and another Ricardo Reicher, I think his name is. Both of them spoke about the problematic of being members of a Jewish community who then came to Israel to report, and the various questions that were raised as to, are you being objective, can you be objective? And I don't know whether this comes into your comments here today, but I'm sure we'd like to hear about that. Following Ethan's lecture, which will be for about half an hour, Professor Amit Shechter of the Department of Communications will make a short response. Professor Amit Shechter is Israeli, originally from Israel, spent much of his career, or part of his career, in the United States. He has an MSc from Mass Communication from Boston University and a PhD in Communication and Law Policy from Rutgers University. His most recent book is called Beyond Broadband Access, Developing Data-Based Information Policy Strategies. And this year, he is one of the 3 recipients at this university of one of the big I-Core Excellence Centres, He is a partner, at least, in this I-Corps Excellence Centre on communication in the digital era. That should take us through the session, because we have another session immediately at 5 o'clock, so I can't promise you there will be any time for questions and answers. We'll see where we get to by the end of Amit's response, and obviously we'll need at least a 5-minute break between this and the next session. So I'm delighted, pleased, to welcome Ethan Bronner to deliver his lecture. And at his request, I'm going to close this laptop because it disturbs him a bit. So you see the title, that's it.
David, thank you very much. David and I don't really know each other. We've never really met, but I read him for years as a columnist in the Jerusalem Post, so it's a great pleasure for me. As he said, I'll try to talk for about a half an hour, and the focus of my talk is what it was like for me for these 4 years between 08 and 12 as the bureau chief. And I want to start at the end, and it's exactly 2 years ago, in May of 12, when Jody Redoran, who's our current bureau chief, was coming to replace me, and I was going to leave. And I wanted to do what correspondents, bureau chiefs have done at the New York Times in Jerusalem, thank you, for, I don't know, 25 or 30 years, which was to throw an event, effectively saying goodbye to me and saying hello to her, an event at which Palestinians and Israelis would both come. So we sent out 150 invitations or whatever, and the Israeli responses came in, and there weren't any Palestinian responses at all. And at a certain point, Hassan Khatib, who is now at Birzeit, but at that time was the spokesman officially for the Fayyad government, called and said, you know, Ethan, thanks very much for that invitation, but you're holding it in Jerusalem, and we can't come to Jerusalem without special permission from the Israelis, and we refuse to ask for it, so we're not going to come. This is because this was in May of 12, as I said, and beginning in November of 11, one of the ways in which Israel had expressed its displeasure about the Palestinian Authorities' attempt to become more recognized at the United Nations was to take away these VIP cards from these officials. So he said, but why don't you have an event in Ramallah? And we'll have an event for you in Ramallah. I said, great, we'll have an event in Ramallah. So we decided there would be 2 goodbye parties, which was fine. And then another day or 2 later, he called me back and he said, you know, we really don't want to cede Jerusalem to the Jews. Why don't you have a Palestinian goodbye party also in Jerusalem? I said, okay, we can do that. And he said, I'll figure out where we're going to do it. So now we have 3 goodbye parties, okay? It's the 3-state solution, as you all know. So we did, in fact, have 3 goodbye parties. And I want to tell you about each one because each has its own sort of lesson to it, I think, and tells us a little something about where we are. The first one, as it happened, was the Jerusalem Palestinian Goodbye Party, and it was held at PASIA, which is this academic organization. PASIA stands for something like Palestinian Association for the Study of something International Affairs. You know, it's run by a guy named Mahdi Abdelhadi. He's neither Fatah nor Hamas. He's a sort of independent, self-described, I would say, pain in the neck. You know, his sort of goal is to be provocative. And he gets his money from Northern Europe, which is what you would expect, where Palestinian think tanks would get their money from these days. Anyway, Mahdi had asked me once before to speak at his institute, and I had agreed. And then it turned out to be the day that Yigal Amir was released in Gaza, and I had to cancel the night before when it became clear that it was happening. Wow. Okay. Is there a psychologist in the room? That's interesting, no? Excuse me. Right. Shalit. That's interesting. Okay. We'll move on from that. And so, anyway, we agreed that I would come and we would come. And so Jody and I and Isabel Kirshner, who's the number 2 in the bureau, all of us went to PASIA in East Jerusalem to speak. And it turned out, of course, that Mahdi had he had another agenda, which was that he was trying to sort of build a relationship with the younger, more radical Palestinians who are very strong on anti-normalization and a BDS approach. And he wanted them to kind of confront me, or he wanted there to be kind of a moment there. So a bunch of them came, about 6 or 8 of them. I was completely unaware of this. And I began speaking, and at one point, someone stands up and says, "Why should I even listen to you? Your newspaper is nothing but a Zionist propaganda rag." And I said, "Do you read the paper?" He said, "I don't need to read the paper. I know what it stands for." And I said, "Well, I mean, I'd be happy to talk about specific stories, you know, but I really don't think that that's correct." And then another one stood up and said, "Are you proud of your son?" So my second son had joined the IDF for a year and 4 months during my time here, causing me a little solace, it'd be fair to say. And I said, "Look, you know, my relationship with my son is kind of between him and me. Are you proud of your son?" I said, "Hey, I'm proud of my son." 6 people get up and walk out. Goodbye, that's goodbye party number 1. The second goodbye party was the Ramallah Palestinian goodbye party. And so Isabel and I and Rina Castelnuovo, who is our fabulous photographer, got into a car to go to Ramallah. And, you know, sometimes you go around and sometimes you go through Calandia. And we went through Calandia, and that was a big mistake. So, you know, sometimes things happen at these places, and you can't predict them, and you don't really even know what's going on while they're happening, and you often don't know what happened afterwards. But for whatever reason, there was a 100-car backup. It's rare that it's problematic to get into Ramallah. Often it's harder to get out. But this was our situation. We had like a 5 o'clock party, and it was like 4:45, and we were 150 cars back, and it was not a good situation. And finally, and you know, it's sort of a useful lesson in life for those who have to cross, typically Palestinians. Anyway, we sort of ditched the car, ran, grabbed a cab, showed up about half an hour late. The hummus had that kind of brown crust thing going on. People had kind of not quite stayed. Anyway, it was not, I mean, there were people there and it was lovely, but it was sort of sad and tragic in its own way. Party number 2. Now, party number 3 was in a venue in West Jerusalem, a place, if you know it, on Mapu Street, on the corner with King David and Mapu, next to the Y. I mean, it's been many things. It's a kind of venue now for these events. And it was very Israeli 2012, which meant the food was fabulous. There was delicious boutique wines, and everything was kind of lovely. And there were 100 or so people there. And there were 2 Palestinians, actually, who came. I think there might have been 3, but I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. They were both people who work with us at the New York Times. The first one is Faris Akram, who is our stringer, fixer, correspondent in Gaza. And unusually, it's pretty hard to get out of Gaza, but we asked the army whether he could be let out, and he had been let out once before, and they said yes, and he was able to come up for this transition. And there he was in this place in West Jerusalem, standing there, you know, and there are sort of Dan Mary doors, and suddenly people begin to realize that there's like a guy from Gaza here in this room, and they wanted to talk to him because Israel has almost no ability to get a sense of what life is like in Gaza. There are no Israeli journalists going into Gaza anymore, and it's, you know, kind of a bit of a black hole now. So they're sort of standing around talking to him, a guy with a kippah, another guy, and, you know, the sort of, the guys at the security things, you know, making their little static noises. And you know, it's sort of amazing. Here is this strange bird in this place, and it was kind of lovely to see. And Faris is a wonderful guy. And the second Palestinian was, he's no longer with us. But he was our stringer, fixer, correspondent in the West Bank for a number of years, Khalid Abu Akr. And Khalid is a Jerusalem Palestinian, right? There are 5 kinds of Palestinians, a quick review of them. There are the 48 Palestinians, those who are Israeli citizens. There are the West Bankers. There are the Gazans. There are the diaspora. And then there are the Jerusalemites who carry so-called blue IDs and have full access to Israel, but do not have citizenship. So that's what he is. And there's something about both Faris and Khalid that I want to share with you, which is that both of their fathers died at the hands of the security service that my son joined. Faris's father was a Fatah activist, and in 1970 died in an Israeli prison. His story, and the story on the street, is that he was tortured to death. I have no way of knowing if that's true. And he's therefore sort of seen as the son of a martyr. And Faris's father was killed by a stray shell in the 08-09 Gaza invasion. And he also, by the way, was a Fatah activist, but quite friendly with Israel, had worked in Israel and so on, and it was clearly not intentional. So you have this sort of odd situation of my 2 closest associates, Palestinians, and you know, we were today at this conference that was held, there were journalists talking about their work in dangerous situations and in the West Bank and in Gaza. Avi Issacharov was there, and some of you know that he was badly attacked on Friday, I think it was. Anyway, these guys have my back, and I have theirs. You know, we have to look out for each other in complicated situations, and there's complete trust between us, among us. And I think it's because we all believe in something, which is the pursuit of journalism. We believe that journalism can make a difference, that there is something meaningful in the search for truth in all its complexity and subtlety and messiness. And I think that we were also linked by something else, a sense that this sense that we have about each other is increasingly falling apart here in this land, in this conflict. That is to say that the ability of Palestinians and Israelis to view one another as human beings with all that that entails is declining. And the contact between Palestinians and Israelis is declining, both willfully and through a series of circumstances, obviously. And I think that this is something that, you know, is kind of a sub-theme of what I want to talk about today to you, because I think it's an extremely dangerous situation. As David said, this was not my first tour as a reporter here. I have been coming here, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I've been coming here for 50 years, but actually I've been coming as a reporter for 30 years. I first came in the 60s when my father took a sabbatical at the Weitzman. But as a reporter, I began in '83, so 3 decades. And I came here for Reuters in the 80s, for the Boston Globe in the 90s, and then for the Times in '08. And I can sort of measure the arc of mutual disdain by examining those 3 decades. When I first got here in '83, a Palestinian in Gaza could get into his or her car and drive to Tel Aviv for dinner and not see a single barrier, not meet a soldier. And, you know, it's true that his license plate had a different license plate on it, but there was not what there is today. I, as a reporter, could drive up to the north, leave my car, call the UN, walk across the border into Lebanon and hail a cab to Sidon or Beirut. And I did it. It's unimaginable today. Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, what negotiations we're not sure, but anyway, he's the chief Palestinian negotiator. Saeb, who lives in Jericho, used to say, and in those days when I first arrived, I think he was the editorial page editor of Al-Quds, used to say to me, you know, I could go and I can't move now. I can't move. And, you know, he likes to say, occupy me again, please, return me to what I was. But obviously it's kind of a dark humor. And today, of course, all of these things are really unimaginable. If you've been coming here for many years, or of course you've lived here all these years, you know, but it's still worth reminding yourself of the changes that have occurred. And I understand, I mean, the changes are not out of the air, right? I mean, these barriers, these fences, these walls, and these checkpoints there's a reason for them. And I'm not here to tell you that it's all the fault of Israel. And my God, what's wrong with these people? Why don't they take down their barriers? We know what happened in the Second Intifada. We know about hundreds of people dying on this side of the line. And I think there's plenty of blame to go around. But on the other hand, it is worth contemplating, it seems to me, whether this is working, whether it's what the long-term implications and meaning is of this kind of a relationship getting worse and worse, as I see it. As you all, those of you who live here remember, and those of you who have visited a lot know, when I first came in the 80s, there were tens of thousands of Palestinians working in Israel, okay? It was not obviously a relationship between equals. It was a kind of Mexican-U.S., a kind of colonial-style relationship. But there were relationships. Palestinians worked here, and they got to know Israelis, and if their child was getting married, they might well invite an Israeli co-worker or supervisor to come to that wedding in Hebron or Ramallah or Nablus, and that person might well have gone. And what it meant was that people got to know each other and to understand that there are families and there are societies and there's stuff going on like your own stuff. And I worry terribly about the fact that that's just not true today. It's also true, and this was, again, part of what we were talking about during our conference today, that in those years, until the late 90s, anyway, the middle 90s, there were no Arabic satellite channels. There was no Al Jazeera. There was no Al Arabiya, Al Manar from Hezbollah. And what it meant was that Palestinians, A, worked here and spoke Hebrew, B, watched Israeli television and knew Hebrew quite well. Now when you go to Gaza, basically the only people who speak Hebrew are over 50. Okay? Nobody else has any relationship to the language or to the culture here. And I also remember something that you may remember, which was when the Oslo process began, the benighted Oslo process. And I remember in '94, there was a poll of Palestinians asking them which democracies they most admire in the world. And ahead of the United States and ahead of Europe was Israel, because they watched TV. They knew that Shelley Yachimovich, who was then not in the Knesset, but yelling at every member of Knesset on the radio at 7 a.m., they knew what that was. They knew that the Israeli society challenged authority, had a robust debate, and they said, you know what, that's what we want for ourselves. It was a complex psychic state to be in, to admire the place that was the source of your troubles, but it was the case for those years. And it was remarkable to talk to Palestinians coming back and hoping to rebuild or to build at that time. So today, the only Israelis that Palestinians see are if there are settlers and they live in the West Bank, or if they're soldiers, or they see them on TV. There are basically almost no dialogue groups, not none, but far fewer than there once were. And of course, there is this extraordinary anti-normalization movement among Palestinians, which seems to be growing only stronger all the time. Meanwhile, as I said, there are no Israeli journalists in Gaza. There are not many that go into the West Bank, so Israelis have put them out of their minds. They've sort of nobody thinks about Gaza anymore. No one thinks of it as having any responsibility toward Gaza. I mean, there is, again, political science argument to be made for why it's legitimate that Israel is not responsible for Gaza, but I think there's also a counter-argument. And I think that what's happened in Gaza, is that there is a kind of a large welfare state in which there's basically no economic development. It has been maintained by UNRWA, by the UN, and it's important to know, as many people abroad fail to know, that Gaza is far from the most impoverished or densest. All of those superlatives are not right. Gaza is not sub-Saharan Africa. Gaza is not the most miserable place on earth, but it is pretty damn miserable. And again, I mean, it's run by Hamas, which is not exactly a Zionist organization, and one can certainly understand, the approach to it by the Israeli government. But again, I think the question that's worth raising is squeezing Gaza working? When I got here, in '08. It was for this last tour. It was just a year since Israel had declared Gaza to be hostile territory, and the fairly open view of intelligence officials when you spoke with them was, if we squeeze them, they will overthrow Hamas. And clearly that hasn't happened. And I think that they recognize that it's not worked, but nobody quite knows what to do differently or is willing to take the chance. You know, my own sense is that the support for Hamas is not very large in Gaza. I don't have any data, but I just have my own impressions from a number of trips there, staying there for days at a time and talking to people. I would say that if you were to take the population of Gaza and you'd say half of the people can stand either Fatah or Hamas. The other half, I would say, is a 60-40 pro-Hamas, which means that Hamas does have, as it were, the political majority, but it's really not a very heavy majority. And as many people have argued, I think it's worth thinking about the question of whether, if you were to, in fact, build up the commercial class in Gaza, the bourgeoisie, it would serve as a kind of natural counter to Hamas. At least that's a reasonable theory. And I actually, during my time here, said it to the Prime Minister in a conversation. We weren't totally alone, but there weren't more than a couple of other people there. And he said to me, you know, I said to him, you are the free market guy. You're the guy who believes in markets, that the ability of markets to affect society. Why don't you think it would be a good idea? He said, well, I think it's not a bad idea, but my security guys really don't want to do it. And one of the, not that long ago, maybe actually a year or two ago, I think I saw The Gatekeepers, the film with the 6 heads of Shabak, former heads of Shabak. And, you know, one of the things about that movie was that in it, every former head is saying, you know, we have to do more politically. We really want a solution. It's the political guys who won't do it. And I thought back to my conversation with the Prime Minister. It's the security guys who won't let me do it. And the truth is nobody has the guts, and one can sort of understand. You don't want people to die under you. Nobody has the guts to really take a chance on this sort of thing. And the result is a kind of stasis, which, when you're here, doesn't feel so bad. Israel is prospering remarkably. But the question is, what's the long-term chances of it lasting? Obviously, Israel can get along without the Arab world. It has, in the last 10 or 15 years, prospered incredibly. I mean, when I got here in '08, I used to say, look how rich Israel is. It's got a GDP per capita of $32,000. Now it's 38. The country is incredible. An incredible success, culturally and economically, and it's a pleasure to be here. It is. It's a pleasure to visit and to live here as well. And it's, you know, got more companies on the NASDAQ than any country in the world, except for the United States and China and maybe Canada. Those numbers sometimes change. It's now a member of the OECD, and of course, Jews used to love to tell the story that they had to wander for 40 years in the desert because they were looking for the one spot in the Middle East without any gas or oil. Well, we have to hang that joke up because of all the natural gas that's been found off of the coast of Haifa, and this country is on its way to being an energy exporter. So that's the sort of paradox of Israel today. It seems to me that it's never been richer, it's never been safer, it's never been more pleasant. There is essentially no terrorism. As I mentioned, the food and wine are awfully good. The highest number of startups per capita in the world. Biggest venture capital industry in the world. But the big question is how to share this land with 5 million Palestinians. And that question is just somehow not being dealt with. Now, one result, it seems to me, of this stalemate is that there is an undue focus on the way you talk about this conflict, because not much has actually changed in about 7 or 8 years since the end of the Second Intifada. I mean, it's really not, there's really no big shift. So all there is this kind of energy around this conflict without much anything happening. And the result is a lot of focus on, if only the story were told in this way, then things could change. And what that means is the focus on how journalists write the story and tell the story in radio and television. when I was the correspondent here, I used to go home a couple of times a year, and one of the things I would do was give talks to groups. And one time before I went, an Israeli friend of mine said to me, "So you're going back to America, whom are you talking to?" I said, "You know, I talk to different groups. I talk to undergraduates, I talk to, like 92nd Street Y, I also talk to Jewish groups." So he sort of grabbed me and he said, "You tell those college students that Israel is not a fascist, apartheid, separatist state." I said, "Okay, I will. And what shall I tell the Jews?" He said, "Tell the Jews it is." And one of the reasons that I tell you the story, apart from it's actually a true story, is that it seems to me it's indicative of the relative nature of the narrative and the story and of truth here, that this is such a long history, there's so much that goes on that you can tell the story in so many different ways and it's still sort of valid because you can back it up. And also, I feel that the narrative has become increasingly calcified, black and white on each side. And I felt my job when I was here was to try to traffic in gray. And I can tell you that in a world of black and white, if you're trying to traffic in gray, it's a great way to get everybody to hate you. And in that, I did have a measure of success during my time here. Every foreign correspondent, no matter where he or she is, wants to tell readers at home two contradictory things. On the one hand, you want to say, "Hey, look, I'm 6,000 or 8,000 miles away from you, but the people here, they may not look like you, they may not dress like you, they may speak a different language and have a different religion, but they love their children, they care about the future, they bleed when you prick them, they like ice cream, they like action movies, they're people just like you and me. You need to grasp their humanity." That's the one thing you want to tell them. Then the second thing you want to tell them is the opposite. You want to say to them, "Okay, so if you think that by knowing that when you prick them, they bleed, that they love their children, they like action movies and ice cream, that you understand them, oh no, my dear friend, you have no idea. These people are completely different from you and me. They have a whole set of cultural, religious, and societal assumptions that you do not share. And if you don't make some effort, with my help, I hope, to try to understand what motivates them and how this place works, you will never understand them. These people are completely different from you and me." And this sort of, you toggle between these two sentiments as a foreign correspondent, at least if you're trying to do your job right. I also think that my goal, and again, I don't claim to have succeeded at it, was to try to get people to question their assumptions about the conflict. Because one of the things, again, about this conflict is, I think I could take stories that I wrote in the 1980s from Reuters and put them in the newspaper today, and you would not be able to tell the difference. I mean, I might have to change a name or two. It's true that some people have died. But fundamentally, the core questions remain. And so this story has been told over and over and over again. So it seemed to me my goal was to try to get people to question their increasingly calcified assumptions about the place. So that if you were someone who believed that if only Israel would get out of the West Bank and help build a Palestinian state, that there would be peace in the Middle East, I want to introduce you to people, to narrative lines, to moments, to details that would make you question that assumption. And if you're, by contrast, someone who thinks no matter what Israel does, under any circumstances, a Jewish state in this region will never be accepted. There'll be war in eternity. Again, I want to introduce you to people and moments and details that would at least make you say, well, maybe that's not 100% true. Each side thinks it gets bad press. And that's partly because everybody gets bad press, okay? The press is not here to tell good stories. That's not fundamentally our job. Basically, we're about conflict and trouble. We don't have full-time correspondents in Norway and Sweden, okay? We don't. We're here because of the conflict. So when people say, why don't you write nice things about Israel? I say, we don't write nice things about anybody. That's just not what journalism is about. Now, I'm not saying there's no role for niceness, and I would certainly agree with those who think it would be nice to have a broader range of stories, and we seek to do that, again, without claiming any success. But I do think that it's not just Israel, it's not just, I mean, I can tell you that our correspondents in Brazil and in India are all thought to be anti-Brazilian and anti-Indian and anti-Russian, right? That's what they think. That, well, why are these people writing such nasty things about us? And the other thing is, even in New York, we don't write a story saying 1 million people went to work today and went home and had dinner with their family. We write about the guy who got shot in the face and thrown in the East River, right? That's what we do. So it's not a comprehensive telling of events. It is a focus on conflict. And I think that, by the way, it's not unique to journalism. I think that bad news plays a special role in our own DNA, in our own. I don't think journalists are smart enough to make this up. I think that it's something that, if you go on vacation for a week in Italy and you eat lovely food and you see the Pietà and everything is wonderful, and on your last day you get robbed and mugged, for the rest of your life, that's the week you got robbed and mugged. I mean, that's how it works. All correspondents not only want to tell two contradictory things, as I said a minute ago, but all have more than one narrative to focus on, okay? We only have 50 foreign correspondents at the New York Times, and there are, 200 countries. So obviously, and within each country, there are many tribes. So people, you have to adjust and learn how to tell different, often contradictory stories, okay? Our person in Rio has to worry about how the Argentines see the world, and they're not exactly in love with the Brazilians. Our person in Rome has to worry about Spain and Portugal. But this job, the Jerusalem job, a little Rahmanos, please, this job is all about opposing contradictory narratives. So you have, that thing that's working its way down along the West Bank border and inside the little of the West Bank too, much of it in occasion. So the Palestinians call it a wall because that sounds nice and aggressive. The Israelis call it a fence because that sounds nice and friendly. And the New York Times calls it a barrier because we hope it doesn't sound like anything. That raised area in the old city of Jerusalem, is it the Temple Mount or is it the Haram al-Sharif? How do you decide? Is it a popularity contest? Let's see. 2 billion Muslims, 75 Jews. No, let's not make it a popularity contest. Is it who got there first? I mean, you have to decide. So we end up saying that spot, which X call and Y call. And, the whole use of the word terrorism. The New York Times shied away enormously from it until September 11th, and then everybody was a terrorist, right? I mean, suddenly, except in this conflict. And it is a problem. I mean, especially because when the things happen at the very moment, and you don't really know what happens, you have to be careful how you report it. And if you're too careful, then people accuse you of trying to hide the terrorist incident when all you knew was that somebody was killed. You didn't know who did it, nor could you say. And if you said police called him a terrorist, say, oh, police called him a terrorist. So, it's not simple. I remember giving a talk at an Orthodox shul in Westchester, New York, and explaining or talking a little bit about the linguistic issues, the wall, the fence, the barrier. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and asked me a question. And in my answer to her, I used the word barrier. She poked me in the chest and she said, fence. You're talking to a fence person now. So she doesn't actually want neutral terminology. She wants a reassertion of her own sense of what's going on. And in fact, that's mostly what people want. And that's why journalists have so much work ahead of them. Okay, I'll just talk for one more or so more minute, and that'll be it. It seems to me, to get away from journalism for 1 second into the conflict, that both sides, both the Palestinian and Israeli side of this, have actually worked fairly hard to prevent a two-state solution. Neither side really, in its gut, believes that this is a land that needs to be shared. It really believes it's its own land. And okay, if you put me in a corner and I have no choice, then if we want to live together, well, maybe. But the core, the DNA of each national movement is that this is ours. I mean, the Palestinians still have hundreds of thousands of refugees in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jordan. And I've visited the camps in every one of those places. And these are people holding on to keys, as you've doubtless read, and holding on to deeds, as if there were very many deeds in those days. But anyway, and being told, hold on, you're going home. And home doesn't mean Ramallah. Home means here. Home means Jaffa. Home means Haifa. And this is a big problem. And I would say that with the beginning in 67, within minutes of the conquest of the West Bank, settlements began to be built. And many of the settlements were built precisely, like Ariel, precisely with one goal in mind, to make it very hard, if not impossible, for a competing sovereign to set up camp there. And so now we have, what, 350, 380,000 people living beyond the Green Line. Let's leave East Jerusalem alone for a minute. It's just hard for me to imagine, and therefore I can't leave you with much of a sense of optimism, that this government, let alone any government, is willing to move any portion of them from their homes, any substantial portion. We all saw what happened in 2005 when 8,000 or 9,000 people needed to be moved. We're talking about 80 to 90, and it's hard to imagine it could happen anyway with this government. So I just don't see either side willing to make the sacrifices needed for this thing to go forward. Now, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. I do know that in 2008 when I arrived, the principal question posed was, when is the West Bank going to blow? And here we are 6 years later, and you can still ask that same question, and maybe the answer is not for a while. I don't know, but I certainly believe that at some point when the children, the very small children who have no memory of the exhaustion of the last Intifada and the pain of it, reach a certain age, there is a risk. So I leave you with that not terribly uplifting thought, and I thank you very much.